History often credits kings and explorers for connecting the world, yet the true architects of the first global economy were far quieter. For centuries, vast ocean trade routes were financed not by royal treasuries, but by sophisticated, private alliances of merchants. This is the story of a hidden financial revolution, a historical mystery of how cross-cultural partnerships moved immense wealth across dangerous seas long before modern banks existed. By the end, you will understand the ingenious systems that built our interconnected world, systems whose blueprints are still hidden in plain sight within modern finance. How did a merchant in Venice fund a spice voyage to India without ever leaving home? What secret contracts allowed capital to flow safely between rivals? The answers reveal a forgotten layer of global history. What does it mean to discover that our world was quietly shaped by networks of trust? A royal fleet arriving in a new land makes for a powerful story. We see the flags, the official charters, the grand claims made in the name of a distant crown. This is the history written in treaties and on maps, a narrative of empires expanding by sheer force of will. But if you listen closely to the quiet rustle of cargo manifests and the faint scratch of a merchant's pen, you hear a different story entirely. While empires focused on claiming territory, a separate, fluid system was focused on something far more practical, moving value from where it was abundant to where it was desperately wanted. The official narrative tells us who owned the land. The hidden reality reveals who actually connected it. This parallel system was built not by admirals, but by alliances of merchants. These were private individuals, often from different cultures and faiths, who formed networks of trust that stretched across oceans. They operated in the shadows of imperial ambition, their success measured not in conquered acres, but in reliable deliveries and repaid loans. Their challenge was monumental. Imagine trying to finance a ship's voyage from Lisbon to the Indian Ocean, a journey that could take over a year. The risks were staggering: shipwreck, piracy, market collapse. A king might fund one such voyage for glory, but for trade to become a continuous, thriving system, a steady stream of capital was required. This leads to the core financial mystery of the age. How did you safely invest a fortune in a venture you could not see, control, or even communicate with for months on end? The answer did not lie in a royal vault. It was being worked out in the back rooms of counting houses and on the crowded docks of port cities, through innovations so clever they would lay the groundwork for our entire modern economy. The true obstacle was not distance itself, but the sheer weight of uncertainty it created. A merchant in Amsterdam might have gold and ambition, while a producer of spices existed half a world away in the Moluccas. The physical gap was vast, but the financial chasm between them was even wider. To bridge it required solving a puzzle of human cooperation on a scale never before attempted. The voyage was a breathtaking gamble. A single ship laden with trade goods represented a colossal concentration of wealth, a floating fortune that would vanish into the horizon for 18 months, sometimes 2 full years, with no word of its progress. Think of that silence: no telegrams, no satellite updates, just an agonizing wait. During that time, the ship faced a gauntlet of perils. A sudden storm could send the entire investment to the ocean floor. Pirates lurked in strategic straits, waiting to claim the cargo for themselves. Even if the ship arrived safely, political landscapes could shift. A friendly port might close, or a local conflict could erupt, making trade impossible. And then there was the most human risk of all: the captain or agent on the other side of the world simply deciding to disappear with the goods. This was the fundamental problem. How do you establish trust with someone you will likely never meet, across a distance where communication is impossible, in a situation where temptation is enormous? Traditional lending, built on local reputation and face-to-face agreements, shattered against these realities. A lender in Genoa could not personally vouch for a ship captain in the Red Sea. This deadlock threatened to strangle global trade in its cradle. The solution could not be a simple handshake. It had to be something more robust, a system engineered not just to move money, but to strategically manage fear. The need was clear: to somehow pool capital from many cautious investors and spread the terrifying risk of a total loss across many different voyages. Out of this pressure, the quiet financiers began to design the first true instruments of global capitalism. They were creating a language of trust written not in words but in contracts. The first and most resilient answer to this puzzle was written in the language of blood and shared tradition. Before corporations or banks, the original engine of long-distance finance was the family. In a world devoid of credit scores or international courts, kinship provided a ready-made system of enforcement. Your reputation was not just your own, it was your father's, your uncle's, your entire clan's. A betrayal in one port would echo back home, bringing not just financial ruin but permanent social exile. This was the power of the family firm, an alliance where trust was not a calculated risk but a sacred inheritance. Consider the Armenian merchants of New Jolfa. In the 17th century, this community, resettled in Persia, spun a web of trade that stretched from Amsterdam to Manila. Their strength was their dispersion. A merchant house in Isfahan would send a trusted younger brother or cousin to establish a branch in Calcutta. That agent, bound by unbreakable familial and religious ties, would manage the sale of Persian silk and the purchase of Indian textiles. Settling accounts across thousands of miles was not a matter of sending gold coins on a perilous journey. Instead, they used a sophisticated system of bills of exchange, essentially handwritten promises to pay, that circulated on the strength of the family's name alone. A debt in Calcutta could be settled by a credit in Venice, all because every node in the network trusted the central family ledger back in New Jolfa. Their shared language, their distinct script, and their common faith created a closed, efficient system that operated seamlessly across the borders of competing empires. Similarly, Chinese merchant clans in Southeast Asia, often called Kongsi, built vast commercial empires based on dialect and lineage. A clan from Fujian province would establish outposts throughout the Indonesian archipelago. A nephew in Batavia would receive shipments of tea and porcelain from his uncle's ships, sell them locally, and use the proceeds to buy pepper and spices for the return voyage. The entire operation was governed by clan rules and overseen by elders. The agent in the foreign port lived and worked within a community that was a miniature version of home, reinforcing his loyalty daily. For Jewish trading families scattered across the Mediterranean and beyond, the diaspora itself became the network, a shared legal tradition, like the Responsa literature where rabbis adjudicated long-distance commercial disputes, provided a portable framework for justice. A merchant in Cairo could enter a partnership with one in Livorno, confident that their contract was backed by a religious and ethical code that transcended any local king's law. These clan networks solved the core problems of early global finance. They provided trustworthy agents in distant lands, individuals whose fidelity was ensured by something deeper than profit. They created internal systems of arbitration and record-keeping that functioned where royal authority did not reach, and they fostered a long-term perspective. This was not about one spectacular voyage, but about nurturing a generational enterprise. The goal was to keep the capital flowing, the information moving, and the family's honor intact for decades, for centuries. The family firm was more than a business. It was a living, breathing institution designed for a disconnected world. Yet, as trade volumes exploded, even the most extensive family tree had its limits. How could this intimate model of trust scale to meet the demands of an entire continent's hunger for spices, silks, and silver? The solution would require a more abstract and more revolutionary leap of faith. But a family's reach, however extensive, was ultimately finite. The explosive growth of trade demanded a system that could connect capital and ambition far beyond the limits of any single lineage. The solution emerged not from a royal decree, but from a simple, brilliant contract that redefined the very nature of investment. Its name was the Commenda in the Italian maritime states and the Carreira in the Islamic world. This was not a corporation or a bank, but a temporary partnership built for a single voyage, and it became the fundamental engine that powered commerce across oceans. The structure was elegantly straightforward, yet its implications were world-changing. Imagine a wealthy merchant in Venice, a person with funds but no desire to face the perils of a sea journey. This sedentary investor would provide 100% of the capital needed for a voyage, say, a ship and a cargo of wool cloth. They would then partner with a traveling merchant, a captain or agent willing to undertake the long, dangerous journey to Alexandria. This traveler contributed no money, only their labor, expertise, and willingness to risk their life. They would sail, sell the wool in Egypt, and use the proceeds to buy a cargo of prized spices like pepper. Upon the ship's safe return, the profits from the sale of the spices would be divided according to a pre-negotiated ratio. A typical split might be 75% for the investor who put up all the money and 25% for the traveler who provided all the sweat and courage. But here was the crucial, revolutionary clause. If the ship was lost at sea, or if the venture failed completely, the traveling merchant lost only their time and effort. They owed the investor nothing. The financial risk of total loss was borne entirely by the capital provider back home. This simple agreement solved multiple problems at once. It separated capital from labor, allowing money to work productively even if its owner stayed safely ashore. It unlocked the wealth of an entire class of people, widows, scholars, landowners, who had funds but no knowledge of the sea, funneling their savings into the arteries of global trade. Most importantly, it created a template for trust between strangers. The contract itself, witnessed and notarized, became the bond. The investor did not need to know the traveler personally. They only needed to trust in the legal framework of the port city and the clear terms of the agreement. This model spread with astonishing speed because it was so adaptable. In the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, the Commenda financed the voyages of Venetian and Genoese galleys. In the Indian Ocean, Islamic merchants used the Carreira, a partnership with deep roots in Islamic commercial law, to fund journeys from Aden to Malabar. The principles were identical: a passive investor, an active agent, a shared profit, and a contained risk. This was more than a business deal. It was a social invention that democratized opportunity. It meant that the prosperity generated by long-distance trade was no longer confined to a small aristocracy or a few daring merchant families. Now, a shopkeeper in Palermo could own a tiny share of a voyage to Constantinople. A retired soldier in Cairo could invest his savings in a caravan heading to the Red Sea. The Commenda and Carreira pooled the collective risk capital of entire cities, transforming trade from a series of heroic gambles into a diversified, systemic enterprise. It turned the terrifying uncertainty of an ocean crossing into a calculable business risk that could be spread across many ventures. This quiet contract, scribbled on parchment in notaries' offices from Italy to Yemen, did something profound. It began to knit the world's markets together with threads of shared financial logic, creating a common language of risk and reward that transcended culture and creed. But as these partnerships multiplied, moving ever larger sums across ever greater distances, a new and more complex challenge emerged. How do you manage a web of investments so vast that no single person can keep track of them all? That elegant contract solved the problem of funding a voyage, but it created a new and equally dangerous problem at the journey's end. A ship returning from the East Indies, its hold bursting with pepper and cloves, represented a fortune in physical form. The spices themselves had value, but the real prize was the silver and gold they could be sold for, and therein lay the next great peril. Moving massive quantities of precious metal across land and sea was an open invitation to disaster. Coins and bullion were heavy, obvious, and irresistible to thieves and corrupt officials alike. A merchant's hard-won profits could vanish in a forest ambush or be confiscated by a local lord claiming some arbitrary fee. The physical movement of Specie, as coin was called, was the Achilles heel of the entire global trade system. It created bottlenecks of risk that threatened to undo all the clever financing that had begun the journey. The solution to this riddle was not a stronger armed guard, but a piece of paper. A financial innovation so powerful it would become the lifeblood of international commerce for centuries, the bill of exchange. This was not money, but a promise that acted like money, a tool for moving immense value without moving a single ounce of silver. Here is how this quiet revolution worked. Let's say a merchant in Lisbon had just sold a shipment of Brazilian sugar and now needed to pay his counterpart in Amsterdam for a shipment of Baltic timber. The traditional method would be to physically ship a chest of gold coins north, a slow, expensive, and perilous undertaking. Instead, the Lisbon merchant would go to his local banker, a man who specialized in such long-distance transactions. The merchant would deposit a sum of Portuguese currency with this banker. In return, the banker would write out a bill of exchange, a formal, handwritten letter of credit. This document instructed the banker's trusted correspondent, or agent, in Amsterdam to pay a specified sum in local Dutch currency to the timber merchant, or to whomever presented the bill. The Lisbon merchant would then send this single, lightweight piece of parchment to his business partner in Amsterdam by ordinary courier. Upon arrival, the Amsterdam merchant would present the bill to the named correspondent, who, after verifying its authenticity, would hand over the agreed-upon guilders. The transaction was complete. Value had traveled from Portugal to the Netherlands instantly, while the actual silver never left Lisbon. The Amsterdam correspondent would later settle his debt with the Lisbon banker through a complex web of offsetting transactions, often using other bills moving in the opposite direction for other clients. It was a magnificent balancing act. The true genius of this system, however, lay not in the paper itself, but in the invisible alliance it required. For a bill of exchange to be trusted, it had to be backed by a network of impeccable reputation. The banker in Lisbon and his correspondent in Amsterdam had to have an absolute, proven trust in one another. They were often members of the same extended family, religious community, or a closed circle of merchant bankers who had done business for generations. This was an alliance of credit, a silent partnership spanning continents, built on a foundation of mutual integrity. When a merchant accepted a bill, he was not trusting the piece of paper. He was trusting the entire, interconnected web of relationships that guaranteed its value. This network effectively created the world's first functional system of international credit and currency exchange. The bill itself often specified an exchange rate, locking in the value between different coinages. It allowed merchants to conduct business anywhere in the known commercial world without the paralyzing fear of moving bullion. Risks from piracy, banditry, and loss at sea were virtually eliminated for the transfer of funds. Capital became fluid, agile, and safe. Think of the profound shift this represented. A merchant in Genoa could now finance a purchase in Alexandria, settle a debt in Bruges, and collect profits in Seville, all through a circulation of handwritten letters between trusted associates. The bill of exchange did more than move money. It accelerated the entire pace of global commerce. It meant that capital could be reinvested faster, opportunities seized more quickly, and partnerships formed across greater distances with less friction. This humble instrument, born from the necessity of security, quietly built the ligaments of the global economy. It allowed the merchant alliances to operate not just as traders of goods, but as architects of a new financial landscape where value was an idea that could travel at the speed of a sailing ship or a fast horse, unburdened by weight. Yet, even this sophisticated system had a limit. It relied entirely on the personal honor and solvency of the individuals in the network. What happened when a single link in that chain failed? When a trusted correspondent faced a sudden crisis and could not honor the flood of bills presented at his door? The quest for security would soon push these financial architects toward an even more radical idea, one that would distribute risk across the entire investing public and give birth to an institution we would recognize instantly today. While the bill of exchange created a paper highway for capital, it still depended on a critical ingredient, a web of people who could be trusted absolutely. This need for trust found its most powerful expression not in a document but in a people. Scattered communities of merchants living far from their ancestral homes became the living, breathing circuitry of global finance. These were the merchant diasporas, and they operated as organic networks where shared identity was the ultimate security system. Take the Gujarati Banias, a community of traders from Western India. For centuries, they spread out across the Indian Ocean world, establishing outposts in East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and Southeast Asia. A Bania merchant in Zanzibar and his cousin in Muscat were not just relatives, they were nodes in a vast, decentralized commercial intelligence network. They shared a language, Gujarati, that was unintelligible to most around them, creating a natural code for business. They operated under a common set of commercial and religious principles rooted in Jainism or Hinduism, which emphasized strict honesty in dealings and placed a profound cultural premium on one's word. This shared framework was their contract enforcement mechanism. If a merchant in Aden failed to pay a debt owed to a partner in Calicut, the news would travel swiftly along the diaspora grapevine. The defaulter would find his credit severed, not just with the original creditor, but with the entire interconnected community. In a world without international courts, this social and economic ostracism was a far more potent penalty than any fine. It made reliability the most valuable asset a merchant possessed. This system allowed for miracles of long-distance finance. A Gujarati trader in Mozambique could receive a letter of credit from his family firm in due, use it to purchase ivory, and know that the bill would be honored by another Bania agent in Oman. Profits could be remitted back home through a series of book transfers within the community, never needing to physically move a chest of rupees across the pirate-infested waters of the Arabian Sea. The diaspora itself was the bank, and its ledger was collective memory. Across the Mediterranean, the Genos performed a similar feat. After the Crusades, Genos merchants established colonies called Mahonsi in places like Chios in the Aegean, Kaffa in the Black Sea, and Tunis in North Africa. These were not just trading posts, they were miniature replicas of Genoa, complete with their own laws, churches, and governance. A Genos merchant in Famagusta, Cyprus, could enter a partnership with a fellow Genos in Seville, Spain, with absolute confidence. Their contract would be based on Genos maritime law, and any dispute could be adjudicated by consuls appointed by the Genos Republic, regardless of what the local sultan or king decreed. This portable legal bubble gave them a staggering commercial advantage. They could raise capital from investors back in Genoa, use it to buy alum in Anatolia, ship it to Flanders for the textile industry, and repatriate the profits, all within a closed system of trust that leapfrogged political borders. The genius of the diaspora model was its resilience. Political empires rose and fell, wars disrupted trade routes, but these networks, rooted in culture and kinship, simply flowed around obstacles like water. A Genos colony might change hands from one empire to another, but the merchants often remained, adapting and maintaining their connections. They were the constant in a world of variables. Their shared language and customs created a low-friction zone for business, where deals could be made with a handshake because the consequences of betrayal were total and communal. This was globalization powered by social bonds, a system where your creditworthiness was your name, and your name was your family's legacy across oceans. These communities did not just move goods, they moved trust itself, in a portable, durable form that no king could mint and no pirate could steal. Yet, for all their sophistication, even these mighty networks faced a ceiling. They were essentially private clubs, magnificent in scope but limited in their ability to mobilize truly massive, impersonal capital from the wider public. The next leap would require turning the entire concept of a trading venture into a piece of property that could be bought and sold on an open market. The true power of these networks lay in their ability to awaken fortunes that were otherwise standing still. For every daring sea captain or bustling port merchant, there existed a far larger, quieter class of individual, people with wealth but no direct involvement in trade. Their capital was often dormant, tied up in land, locked in strongboxes, or invested in local, safe ventures. The merchant alliances became expert at finding this sleeping wealth and convincing it to go on a journey. They tapped into a vast reservoir of passive investors, drawing funds from far beyond the traditional commercial class and funneling them into the high-risk, high-reward world of oceanic voyages. This was the democratization of global finance in its earliest form. Consider a landed noble in the countryside of France or England. His income was steady, derived from the rents of tenant farmers, but it was largely fixed, tied to the agricultural cycles of his estate. The stories returning from Lisbon or Antwerp, however, spoke of fortunes made in spices and silks, returns that could double or triple an investment in a single voyage. The noble had the capital, often in the form of silver plate or coin, but he lacked the expertise, the connections, and the stomach for the immense risk. He could not sail to Calicut himself. This is where the merchant banker stepped in, acting as a crucial intermediary. Through instruments like the Commenda, the noble could become a silent partner. He would provide a substantial sum to a reputable merchant house, which would pool it with capital from other passive investors, a local bishopric, a wealthy widow, a retired government official. This pooled fund would then finance a specific voyage or be spread across several to mitigate risk. The noble's role ended with his initial investment. He became a sleeping partner, his capital now working for him on the other side of the world. While he remained at his estate, he would not direct the voyage, choose the cargo, or negotiate with foreign suppliers. His only active duty was to wait, sometimes for years, for the ship's return and his share of the profits. Religious institutions were major players in this silent economy. Monasteries, bishoprics, and charitable foundations often controlled significant wealth from endowments and land holdings. Their mandate was to preserve and grow their assets to fund their religious and charitable works. Investing in a diversified portfolio of trading voyages, arranged through trusted merchant families, became a prudent way to achieve this growth. The capital of a monastery in Flanders could thus help fund a Portuguese carrack heading to Goa, its returns later used to repair a church roof or feed the poor. Even widows and unmarried women of means, whose financial options were severely limited by law and custom, found a path to economic agency through these passive investments. A widow might invest her inheritance or dowry settlement with a merchant alliance run by her late husband's trusted associates. Her capital would work in the global market, generating an income that provided her with independence and security, all without her ever setting foot on a trading floor or violating social norms. This system performed a kind of financial alchemy. It transformed static, localized wealth, the silver in a lord's treasury, the savings in a widow's chest, the endowment of a cathedral, into fluid, global capital. It broke wealth free from the soil and set it sailing. By drawing from these disparate sources, the merchant alliances achieved a critical mass of funding that no single family or even a consortium of active traders could muster alone. They created a bridge between the old world of agrarian wealth and the new world of global commerce. The sleeping partner took on the ultimate risk, total loss, in exchange for the potential of spectacular gain without any labor. The active merchant gained the operational capital needed to compete on a global scale. This symbiotic relationship quietly built the economic foundation for an interconnected world. It meant that the hunger for pepper in Europe was financed not just by spice merchants, but by the collective, dormant wealth of an entire continent, from its abbeys to its aristocratic estates. This silent partnership model, however, was still fundamentally private and personal. The risk, though spread among many passive investors, was still concentrated in a few hands. What would happen when a single venture demanded more capital than even a wide network of sleeping nobles and bishops could provide? The solution would require a final, bold evolution, transforming the very idea of a trading company into something that could be owned by the public itself. But all this abstract architecture of trust and credit needed a physical home. The grand alliances and intricate contracts could only function in specific places designed for their purpose, ports that were less like cities and more like elaborate machines for global exchange. These were the neutral hubs, the cosmopolitan crossroads where the merchant networks truly came to life. Malacca, on the Malay Peninsula, was one such legendary node. By the 15th century, it was not a city belonging to any one empire, but a marketplace belonging to the world. Its strategic position allowed it to control the vital strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Here, Gujarati merchants traded cotton for Sumatran pepper. Chinese junks unloaded porcelain and silk to exchange for spices and sandalwood from the Moluccas. Arab dhows brought goods from the Red Sea, while traders from Burma and Siam brought gems and rice. What made Malacca work was not a powerful navy, but its role as a neutral zone. The local sultanate provided just enough order, security, and a standardized system of weights and harbor fees. Beyond that, commerce governed itself. The city was a patchwork of distinct quarters, each with its own warehouses, homes, and places of worship for different merchant communities. A Persian trader could live under the commercial customs of his homeland, resolve a dispute with a Tamil partner through a merchant council, and never need to appeal to a distant king's law. The infrastructure was purpose-built. Vast godowns or warehouses lined the waterfront where goods could be stored, inspected, and taxed at a known rate. Taverns and guesthouses served as informal trading floors and information exchanges. Most critically, notaries and scribes fluent in multiple languages worked constantly, drafting the bills of lading, partnership contracts, and letters of credit that made the system legal and binding. This environment allowed for the spontaneous formation of the very alliances we've been discussing. A Venetian merchant, stranded far from home after his ship was damaged, could partner with a local Malay boat builder and an Armenian financier to create a new hybrid venture, all within the space of a week. The port city provided the stage, the props, and the common language of commerce for these performances of trust. Across the Indian Ocean, Aden played a similar role. Perched on the arid tip of the Arabian Peninsula, it was a natural funnel for goods moving between India and the Mediterranean. Its deep, sheltered harbor was a sanctuary from the monsoon winds. Here, the Rasulid sultans were clever enough to understand that their wealth came from facilitating trade, not controlling it. They maintained a powerful lighthouse, repaired port facilities, and most importantly, enforced a reputation for fair and predictable justice. A merchant who felt cheated in Aden's suck could bring his case before a commercial judge who understood the nuances of long-distance trade law. This reliability was Aden's true commodity. It meant that a Jewish merchant from Cairo, a Hindu bania from Gujarat, and a Muslim trader from Hormuz could all meet in a warehouse in Aden, negotiate a complex three-way deal involving future deliveries of pepper, immediate payment in silver, and transport on a shared vessel, with confidence that the agreement would be honored. The city itself was the trusted third party. Later, Amsterdam would perfect this model in the Atlantic world. Its famous exchange bank, founded in 1609, provided a guaranteed, secure place to deposit and transfer funds, solving the problem of varying coin qualities that plagued other ports. Its commodity exchanges and insurance markets formalized the ad hoc practices of earlier hubs, but the principle remained the same: create a space governed by commercial logic, not political whim, where capital and goods could meet with minimal friction. These ports were the physical synapses of the global brain. In them, the abstract systems of credit and the intimate networks of diaspora found concrete expression. They were melting pots where commercial norms were forged not by imperial decree, but by daily necessity, where a handshake between strangers from opposite ends of the earth could be worth more than a royal seal. This raises a fascinating question, however. What happened when these brilliantly efficient, merchant-run systems finally caught the attention of the very empires whose edges they had so skillfully navigated? The most precious cargo on any ship was never listed on the manifest. It traveled in locked chests carried by trusted captains, and its value was measured not in weight but in timeliness. This was information, and in the game of global trade, it was a form of currency more potent than silver. A merchant alliance's true wealth lay not just in its capital, but in the speed and accuracy of its intelligence network. While goods moved at the pace of the wind and currents, news of their fate had to move faster. The entire financial architecture of trust depended on it. Imagine the stakes. You have invested in a pepper voyage from Calicut to Lisbon. For 18 months you hear nothing. Then a fast-sailing pinnace, a smaller, swifter vessel, arrives months ahead of the lumbering spice galleons. Its captain delivers a single letter to your counting house. It reports that your ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope safely, that the pepper crop in India was poor, and that prices in Alexandria are soaring due to a rumor of war. This single piece of parchment is a fortune. You now know to hold your pepper for the highest bidder in Antwerp, not sell it quickly in Lisbon. You have been handed a map of the future, drawn in ink. This advantage was not luck. It was a system financed and maintained by the alliances themselves. They paid a premium for speed, maintaining dedicated courier services and reserving space on the fastest available ships solely for letters and ledgers. A Genos merchant house might have a standing agreement with the captains of Venetian light galleys, the express trains of the Mediterranean, to carry their correspondence ahead of the regular trade fleets. In the Indian Ocean, where monsoon winds dictated sailing seasons, merchants would send word overland through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf to shave crucial weeks off the news cycle. The intelligence gathered was meticulously specific. It was not just about prices, but about politics, personalities, and perils. Which local official in Hormuz was newly appointed and open to a favorable deal? Had pirates been sighted near Socotra? Was the Sultan of Gujarat ill, potentially destabilizing the market? Had a rival ship foundered off the Malabar coast? This last piece of information was especially critical. News of a shipwreck, if received before the general market knew, was a dual-edged sword. For the owner, it was tragic, but for a sharp merchant with access to the early report, it was an opportunity. He could quietly buy up insurance contracts on that route, knowing their price was about to skyrocket when the news became public. He could also corner the market on the specific goods that were lost, anticipating a shortage. This practice, while ruthless, underscores a central truth. In this world, knowledge was not just power, it was direct profit. the networks protected this flow of information with the same ingenuity they applied to finance. Letters were often written in code or cipher, with key details hidden in seemingly innocuous commercial language. A phrase about the health of a fictional relative might convey the arrival of a fleet. They used trusted couriers, often members of the same diaspora community, who were paid handsomely for their discretion and speed. A Jewish courier traveling the overland routes between Cairo and Venice carried the economic pulse of continents in his saddlebag. The merchant alliances effectively built a private, global internet centuries before the digital age. Each node, each family branch or correspondent in a foreign port was both a receiver and a transmitter of vital data. They wrote detailed newsletters called Avisi in Italy, which circulated among closed groups of subscribers, providing analysis alongside raw facts. This shared intelligence created a collective mind, allowing the network to react to global events with a coordination that isolated traders could never match. It meant that a drought in Ceylon could trigger a buy order for cinnamon in Amsterdam within a matter of months, not years. The system had a profound democratizing effect within the alliance. A junior partner stationed in a remote outpost gained immense value by being a reliable source of local news. His careful reports on crop yields or political unrest were his contribution to the collective wealth, earning him standing and a share of the rewards. The flow of information was the glue that held the abstract financial instruments together. A bill of exchange was only as good as the reputation of the man who signed it, and that reputation was maintained by the constant, verified chatter of the network. This relentless pursuit of knowledge reveals the merchant alliances as something far more sophisticated than mere traders. They were early information age corporations, understanding that controlling the narrative of supply and demand was the ultimate key to wealth. But this very sophistication, this ability to operate as a state within states, would eventually draw a formidable and jealous gaze. What happens when the architects of the system become powerful enough to challenge the crown itself? The relentless pursuit of profit demanded an equally ingenious defense against catastrophe. For all their contracts and networks, a single storm could still erase a lifetime's fortune in one terrible moment. The ultimate innovation, therefore, was not about making more money, but about surviving the inevitable loss. This was the birth of insurance, a direct and brilliant product of the alliance mindset. The earliest forms emerged not in government offices, but in the bustling, smoke-filled coffee houses of port cities like Lloyd's of London. Here, merchants and ship captains would gather, sharing news and, crucially, sharing risk. The system was elegantly simple. A ship owner about to send a vessel on a dangerous voyage would draw up a document listing the ship and its cargo, its value, and its intended route. He would then take this paper around the coffee house, inviting other merchants to sign their names and pledge a sum of money underneath. Each signer was agreeing to cover a small, specified portion of the total value if the ship was lost. In return, the ship owner paid each signer a fee, a premium. If the ship arrived safely, the signers kept their fees as pure profit. If it sank, they paid their pledged amounts to the owner, making him whole. This was risk chopped into pieces and distributed so widely that no single loss could be devastating. The system was built on the very trust these alliances had cultivated. You would only sign your name and pledge your capital for a voyage captained by someone you knew, or for a merchant whose reputation was solid. The coffee house was the marketplace for this trade in uncertainty, and a man's signature was his bond. But even before these formal agreements, merchants used financial instruments that functioned as proto-insurance. Two of the most important were the Bottomry and Respondentia loan. These were not insurance policies but clever loans designed for high-risk travel. In a Bottomry loan, a merchant or ship owner would borrow money using the physical hull of the ship itself as collateral. In a Respondentia loan, the cargo in the hold served as the collateral. The terms were stark and revolutionary. The lender would provide a large sum of money upfront, often to fund the voyage itself or to make repairs. The loan would be due with substantial interest only upon the safe arrival of the ship or cargo at its destination. But here was the critical clause: if the ship was lost at sea, the loan was completely forgiven. The lender absorbed the total loss. This was a gamble for the lender, but the interest rates were so high, sometimes 50 or even 100%, that the profits from many successful voyages easily covered the occasional total loss. It was, in essence, a bet on the seaworthiness of a vessel and the skill of a captain, with the loan document itself acting as a kind of insurance policy for the borrower. The genius of these systems, from the coffee house subscriptions to the Bottomry loans, was how they institutionalized the alliance principle of shared fate. They turned a potential community crippling disaster into a manageable, calculable business expense. A merchant no longer had to bet his entire fortune on one ship. He could now spread his capital across 10 different voyages, each insured by a different group of his peers. He could also earn steady income by acting as a lender or signer on the voyages of others. This created a resilient web where capital was constantly recycled, and where a loss in one thread was absorbed by the strength of the whole fabric. It was cooperation forged not from altruism, but from enlightened self-interest, a realization that collective security was the best guarantee of individual prosperity. This quiet revolution in risk management meant that trade could scale exponentially. Investors who were once terrified of the sea could now participate with a known, limited downside. More capital flowed in, funding more ships, more voyages, and more connections. The insurance contract became the final, crucial piece of paperwork in the merchant's toolkit, a formal declaration that even the ocean's fury could be measured, priced, and ultimately tamed by human agreement. Yet, as these private systems of finance and risk grew more powerful and self-contained, they began to form a shadow economy of staggering scale. This raised a question with profound implications. What happens when a network of merchants becomes richer and more organized than the kingdoms that supposedly rule them? A promise on paper is only as strong as the system that enforces it. For the merchant alliances, trust was not blind faith. It was a meticulously recorded science. Their sprawling financial webs, with silent partners in one city and active agents in another, demanded a way to see the entire picture at a glance, to track who owed what to whom across years and oceans. The solution was a quiet revolution in numbers, double-entry bookkeeping. Before this, a merchant's ledger might simply list expenses and income in a single column, a chaotic diary of transactions. Double entry changed everything by introducing a powerful concept. For every value received, a value was given. Every transaction was recorded twice, as a debit in one account and a credit in another. If you sold a shipment of wool, your wool stock account was credited, decreasing its value, while your cash or receivables account was debited, increasing. This created a constant, self-balancing equation. The genius was in the clarity it provided for partnerships: an investor's capital contribution, an agent's salary, a share of profits from a specific voyage. All could be held in separate, interlocking accounts within the same ledger. A merchant in Genoa could open the book and instantly see not just his own wealth, but the exact financial status of his partnership with a ship captain in Cyprus, or the outstanding debt owed by a correspondent in Bruges. It turned a sprawling, invisible network of obligations into a single, comprehensible map of financial relationships. This was the technological backbone of trust, a common language of accountability that every member of an alliance, regardless of their native tongue, could understand and audit. But a clear ledger needed a clear starting point, a contract that defined the obligations in the first place. This is where the notary became indispensable. In ports from Barcelona to Alexandria, notaries were the engineers of commerce. They were not mere scribes, but legal experts who drafted standardized, ironclad partnership agreements, bills of lading, and powers of attorney. When a Commenda contract was drawn up, the notary ensured every contingency was covered: the split of profits, the division of losses, the agent's responsibilities, the timeline for the voyage. This document, sealed and witnessed, was the foundational truth. It removed ambiguity and memory from the equation. If a dispute arose 2 years later, the partners didn't argue over what was said, they consulted the parchment. The notary's archive became a trusted, neutral repository of truth, a place where the abstract trust between individuals was made permanently concrete in ink and wax. And when disputes did inevitably arise, the merchant alliances could not afford to wait for the slow wheels of royal justice, where a judge might know land law but have no grasp of maritime insurance or exchange rates. They created their own justice. Across Europe, bustling fairs and ports hosted pea-powder courts. The name comes from the French pied poudre, meaning dusty foot, a court for travelers who needed swift resolution before moving on. These were tribunals run by merchants for merchants, often convened within hours of a dispute. The judges were experienced traders themselves who understood commercial custom. Their law was not the king's statute, but the widely accepted practices of the trade. The lex mercatoria, or law merchant, was a bill of exchange properly endorsed. Did a delay in delivery constitute a breach of contract under standard trade practice? These courts could decide quickly, and their judgments were respected because the entire commercial community relied on their credibility. To be banned from the pea-powder court was to be banished from business itself. In the Islamic world, the qadi, or judge, often specialized in commercial law, drawing on the sophisticated frameworks within Islamic jurisprudence for partnerships like the Carreira. In the merchant diasporas, community elders or religious leaders acted as arbitrators. The principle was universal: justice had to be fast, expert, and grounded in the reality of commerce. This parallel legal system was the final, crucial pillar. It meant that a promise made in a Lisbon counting house could be enforced in a Rialto market, not by soldiers, but by the collective power of a self-governing commercial society. The ledger recorded the promise, the notary codified it, and the merchant court stood ready to defend it. Together, they formed an invisible infrastructure that made the world feel smaller and safer for capital, long before nations agreed on a single law. The quiet systems we've traced were not born in the Renaissance, but centuries earlier, in the shadows of a fractured world. Long before Venetian galleys or Genoese caravans, a single merchant alliance demonstrated that the globe could be stitched together with threads of trust. They were known as the Radhanites, Jewish merchants whose documented network in the 9th and 10th centuries presents a stunning blueprint for everything that would follow. Operating from their heartland in the Frankish Empire, likely in the Rhone Valley, these traders did not merely cross borders, they rendered them almost meaningless. Their routes, meticulously recorded by geographers of the Abbasid Caliphate, formed a complete circuit of the known world. One path went overland through Slavic territories to the Black Sea and onward. Another sailed from Mediterranean ports to Egypt, then traversed the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. A third, almost unimaginable in its ambition, stretched overland through Baghdad, across Persia and Central Asia, all the way to the markets of Tang Dynasty China. This was not occasional contact, it was a scheduled, reliable system. The Radhanites moved the most exquisite goods of their age, transporting Slavic furs and Frankish swords eastward, and returning with musk, spices, cinnamon, and silk westward. But their most vital cargo was arguably their role as a financial lifeline. In an era of frequent conflict between the Christian kingdoms of Europe and the Islamic Caliphate, they operated within both spheres. They were cultural and economic intermediaries, fluent in multiple languages including Arabic, Persian, Romance languages, and likely Slavic tongues. This unique position allowed them to facilitate more than just trade. They moved capital and credit across a civilizational divide. While no Radhanite ledger survives, historians reconstruct their methods from later practices and the sheer logic of their operation. Moving bulk silver or gold across such vast, hazardous distances would have been impractical and suicidal. It is almost certain they employed early forms of the bill of exchange, or saftaja as it was known in the Islamic world. A merchant in Cologne could deposit funds with a Radhanite colleague, receiving a letter of credit. This document would be honored by another Radhanite agent in, say, Baghdad or Cairo, allowing for the local purchase of goods without a single coin crossing a bandit-infested mountain pass. Their network itself was the guarantee. Trust was enforced by tight communal bonds, shared religious law, and the profound social consequence of failing one's brethren across such a vast diaspora. A Radhanite who betrayed a partner in Canton would find his reputation and his ability to do business shattered from Spain to Sind. They were more than merchants, they were a walking, talking financial infrastructure. They provided the early medieval world with its first working model of a truly global, multicultural commercial alliance, proving that capital and goods could flow smoothly across political and religious frontiers if the human network was robust enough. Their success laid down a pattern, a hidden map of connectivity, that later networks would spend centuries rediscovering and expanding upon. The Radhanites proved a network could span continents, but Venice demonstrated how to weaponize that principle for the power of a city-state. Here, the private alliance did not just operate alongside the state, it became an extension of it, engineered into a machine for imperial ambition. The Venetian system was called the Colleganza, a sophisticated evolution of the basic Commenda contract, and it turned every wealthy citizen into a potential investor in the Republic's maritime destiny. Unlike the purely private, ad hoc partnerships of earlier networks, the Colleganza was often standardized and overseen by the Venetian state, especially for the critical, state-organized galley convoys to Alexandria and Beirut. The structure was familiar. A sedentary capitalist provided the bulk of the funds, often 3/4 of the capital, while a traveling merchant contributed his labor and expertise for the remaining share. But the Venetian twist was scale and purpose. The state would announce an upcoming muda, the scheduled convoy to the Levant. It would specify the route, the departure date, and the types of goods permitted. Then it would open a kind of public subscription. Citizens with capital would flock to the docks of the Rialto, seeking out ship captains and merchants approved for the voyage, forming Colleganza partnerships on the spot. The state provided the security of a military escort for the galleys, the diplomatic treaties with foreign powers, and the legal framework to enforce the contracts. In return, it ensured a steady, massive flow of capital into ventures that directly served Venetian geopolitical and economic interests. The entire city became a single, diversified investment fund for dominating the spice trade. This created a powerful fusion. A nobleman's fortune was no longer idle gold. It was transformed into a stake in the Republic's naval power. His personal profit was now perfectly aligned with the state's prosperity. If the galley fleet succeeded, Venice grew richer, its defenses stronger, and the nobleman's coffers swelled. This alignment of interests generated a staggering concentration of capital and political will. It meant Venice could launch enormous, well-protected fleets year after year, a consistency that purely private ventures could rarely guarantee. The contrast with the earlier, stateless networks is revealing. The Gujarati Banias or the Armenian merchants of New Jolfa operated in the cracks between empires, their strength derived from their neutrality and agility. Their trust was familial and cultural, enforced by community ostracism. Venice, however, built trust through institutional rigidity. Your Collegantia contract was backed not just by your partner's word, but by the full legal and naval might of the Serenissima. Your risk was mitigated not only by spreading investments, but by the knowledge that the state's warships were sailing alongside your cargo. This represented one end of a spectrum where merchant capital and state power became virtually indistinguishable. Other models existed along this continuum. In the Hanseatic League, a network of North German trading cities, merchant capital created its own quasi-state, building fortified trading posts, negotiating treaties, and raising fleets to protect its members, all without a single king at its head. It was merchant power coalescing into a political entity. At the opposite end were the purely private, clandestine networks that deliberately avoided state entanglements to maintain flexibility and avoid taxes. The Venetian model, however, showed the explosive potential of a full merger. It solved the problem of mobilizing capital on a colossal scale by making public service and private profit two sides of the same golden coin. Yet this very success contained a seed of tension. When the state is both the rule maker and a dominant player in the game, what happens to the innovative, disruptive spirit of the private alliance? And what occurs when a rival power discovers a way to mobilize capital that is even more fluid, more impersonal, and utterly detached from any single individual's reputation or lifespan? The Portuguese carracks that rounded the Cape of Good Hope flew the king's flag, but they sailed on money from Genoa. This is the great contradiction of the Carreira da India, the famed pepper run. Official history paints it as a royal monopoly, a direct pipeline from the crown to the spice groves of the East. The reality was a complex multinational financial operation, a quiet partnership that stretched from the banks of the Tagus River to the counting houses of Italy and the merchant guilds of India. The Portuguese state provided the ships, the guns, and the royal charter. But the venture's lifeblood, the immense capital required to outfit a fleet and fill its holds with trade goods, flowed through a web of private alliances. The crown was perpetually short of funds, its treasury drained by the costs of empire. For the steady stream of silver needed to buy pepper in India, Lisbon turned to the experts, the Genoese banking families. These financiers had spent centuries mastering the art of long-distance risk. They formed syndicates to underwrite entire voyages, advancing huge loans to the Portuguese crown secured against the future cargo of pepper. In essence, they were betting on the safe return of ships they would never see. The contract was simple in principle. The bankers provided the cash upfront, and when the pepper was sold at the royal warehouse in Lisbon, the crown repaid the loan with interest, and the bankers took a hefty share of the profits. It was a classic Commenda on a national scale, with the King of Portugal as the traveling merchant and the Genoese as the sedentary investors. This system meant that the wealth of the Italian peninsula was quietly financing Portugal's Eastern Empire. A Genoese banker's gold became the silver cruzados that Portuguese factors carried to the markets of Cochin and Goa. Without this cross-border infusion of capital, the Carreira da India would have stalled after its first few celebrated voyages. But the financial alliances did not end in Europe. Once a Portuguese carrack arrived in Asia, it entered a commercial ecosystem it could not control. The Estado da India, the Portuguese colonial administration, possessed naval power but lacked the deep local networks to source spices efficiently across the vast Indian Ocean. For this, they depended entirely on existing merchant alliances, particularly the sophisticated Gujarati and Tamil trading communities. The Portuguese did not sail to the Spice Islands themselves for decades. They operated as wholesalers at the hub. Gujarati merchants, with their intricate networks spanning from East Africa to Sumatra, would procure the pepper, cinnamon, and ginger from local producers and bring it to Portuguese-controlled ports like Goa. There, the Portuguese factor would purchase it, using the very silver financed by Genoa. In some cases, the partnerships went deeper. Portuguese officials often entered into informal joint ventures with local merchants, providing protection for their ships in exchange for a share of the cargo or privileged pricing. A Tamil merchant in Malacca might use a Portuguese vessel with its feared cannons to safely transport a cargo of textiles through pirate-filled waters, splitting the profit. This was not a monopoly, it was a collaboration, often grudging and tense but essential. The entire edifice of the Portuguese pepper trade, therefore, rested on a triple foundation: Genoa's capital, Portuguese military logistics, and Gujarati and Tamil commercial networks. It was a fragile, hybrid system where European state ambition was utterly dependent on both international finance and local mercantile cooperation. The Crown claimed the monopoly, but the profit was a shared secret, distributed among bankers in Italy, merchants in Gujarat, and officials in Goa long before it ever reached the royal treasury. This reveals a profound truth. Even the most iconic state enterprises of the age were, at their core, mosaics of private alliance. The world was being connected not by monolithic empires, but by these adaptable, often invisible, partnerships of necessity. That fragile hybrid of state and private capital would eventually be outmaneuvered by a model of pure, unadulterated network power. While empires rose and fell, one merchant community perfected the art of global trade by building a nation that existed nowhere on any map. In the 17th century, thousands of Armenians were resettled by the Persian Shah Abbas into a suburb of his capital, Isfahan. They named it New Jolfa. From this single node, they spun a commercial web of breathtaking scope, connecting markets no empire could even comprehend. Their secret was not a fleet or a charter, but a social fabric woven so tightly that trust became their most exportable commodity. A merchant in New Jolfa could send a shipment of Persian silk to his cousin in Madras, with instructions to sell it and use the proceeds to purchase diamonds for a client in Venice, all through a simple system of handwritten notes and absolute familial honor. The entire operation was governed not by a king, but by a council of elders, the Khan, who acted as a supreme commercial court, arbitrating disputes and enforcing contracts across continents. This was a true merchant republic, its territory defined not by borders, but by the reach of its kinship ties. Their financial instrument was the hundi, a bill of exchange so trusted it functioned as a global currency within their diaspora. A hundi drawn on a New Jolfa merchant house could be cashed for local coin in Amsterdam, Manila, or Calcutta, because every Armenian agent knew the family's reputation was the ultimate collateral. The system was flawless because betrayal was unthinkable. A merchant who defaulted would find his entire lineage shunned, cutting off not just his business, but the futures of his children and grandchildren. To ensure this web hummed with efficiency, they built one of history's most impressive private communication networks. Specialized couriers traveling along established routes carried business letters, hundis, and market intelligence with remarkable speed and security. These couriers often used a secret mercantile script, a form of shorthand, to protect sensitive information about prices and politics. News of a shipwreck in the Philippines or a price surge for cochineal dye in Amsterdam would race across this network, giving Jolfan merchants a critical informational edge. They mastered the art of being indispensable intermediaries. In Manila, they were the crucial link in the famed Manila galleon trade, exchanging Persian carpets and Indian textiles for Spanish-American silver. In Russia, they held monopolies on the silk trade. In the Mediterranean, they supplied the Ottoman court. They moved seamlessly between Christian, Muslim, and Hindu worlds, their neutral identity as a stateless diaspora becoming their greatest commercial asset. They created, in essence, a seamless financial and informational zone that operated with a coherence no territorial empire could match. Their capital was mobile, their loyalty was to the network, and their law was the word of their elders. This was the quiet alliance perfected, a global powerhouse that proved you could rule the world's markets without controlling a single inch of its soil. Their mastery of trust was also a shield against the outside world. To protect the immense advantages they had built, these merchant alliances erected invisible barriers, not with walls but with secrets. The most valuable asset they guarded was not gold or spices, but knowledge, specialized information so critical that it was kept within the family or the community, locked away from competitors. Consider the Portuguese roteiros, the secret navigational charts used for the Carreira da India. These were state secrets, but the principle was the same. In private networks, a captain's personal logbook, filled with notes on currents, safe harbors, and hidden reefs, was a hereditary treasure passed from father to son. This was proprietary data in its purest form, a map to profit that outsiders could not buy. Similarly, the most sensitive knowledge was the ledger of contacts, the personal relationships with a specific supplier in the Moluccas or a trustworthy customs official in Aden. This web of human connections, built over a lifetime, was an intangible fortress. An outsider might have the capital to fund a voyage, but without the name of the right broker in Calicut, they would pay triple the price or receive inferior goods. The alliances protected this social capital fiercely, communicating it through trusted couriers and in-person briefings, never in any document that could be intercepted. Marriage was another strategic instrument in this defensive architecture. It was far more than a personal union. It was a merger of capital, reputation, and information networks. When two powerful merchant families arranged a marriage, they were deliberately strengthening the bonds of their commercial alliance, creating a blood tie that made betrayal not just a business loss, but a familial catastrophe. A daughter's dowry was often a substantial infusion of capital into the groom's trading ventures, while the marriage itself granted both families access to each other's trusted agents in distant ports. This practice created dynasties of commerce, where loyalty and business acumen were literally bred into the next generation. The children of these unions were raised within the culture of the network, learning its codes, its language of trade, and its unwritten rules from infancy. They became the perfect, culturally fluent agents to send to a foreign outpost, individuals whose very identity was synonymous with the alliance's interests. This closed system of kinship created a formidable barrier to entry. You could not marry your way into the inner circle of the Armenian merchants of New Jolfa or the Gujarati Banias unless you were born into it. The network regenerated itself biologically, ensuring that its core secrets and its highest levels of trust remained within a defined group. These practices naturally led to business methods that were deliberately opaque to outsiders. The use of private scripts and ciphers in correspondence, like the mercantile shorthand of the Jolfan Armenians, was a standard practice. Account books, even when using double entry, were often kept in a private dialect or included coded entries understandable only to initiated family members. Complex multi-party transactions might be settled through a series of internal book transfers, leaving no clear paper trail for a tax collector or a curious competitor to follow. The goal was not necessarily to deceive authorities, though that certainly happened, but to maintain efficiency and security within the trusted circle. This culture of discretion made the alliances incredibly resilient, but it also rendered them quiet, almost ghostly, in the historical record. Historians often piece together their operations from fragments, a surviving letter here, a lawsuit there, a ledger entry in an archive. The full, vibrant reality of their daily negotiations, their whispered deals on crowded docks, and the subtle cues of trust exchanged between lifelong partners is largely lost to us. They were designed that way. Their greatest strength was an impenetrable privacy that time has only deepened. This raises a poignant question for us today. how much of history is shaped not by the loud events we can easily see, but by the countless quiet agreements we can never fully hear. This intricate web of trust was not woven from naivety, but from a clear-eyed understanding of human temptation. For every honest agent managing a fortune on the other side of the world, the possibility of fraud was a constant, chilling shadow. The system's true strength was not in preventing betrayal, but in having crafted a response so severe that few dared to risk it. The most common threat was simple disappearance. An agent in a distant port, entrusted with the sale of a valuable cargo, might sell the goods, pocket the silver, and vanish into the local population, sending back a fabricated tale of piracy or market collapse. More subtle was embezzlement, where an agent would inflate expenses, claim losses from spoiled goods, or engage in side deals using the alliance's capital for personal gain, slowly siphoning wealth from the partnership. Then there was outright default, where a merchant, perhaps due to genuine business failure or reckless speculation, found himself unable to honor a bill of exchange or repay a loan, leaving his creditors holding worthless paper. These were not theoretical risks, they were daily realities that could unravel years of careful accumulation in an instant. Formal legal recourse was often useless. A merchant in Genoa could not realistically sue a defaulter in Cairo in a local court, where the judge had no understanding of Commenda law and the process could take years. The alliances, therefore, developed their own powerful, extra-legal justice system, one built on social and economic consequences far swifter and more terrifying than any royal decree. The primary weapon was total ostracism. News of a default or fraud would travel with astonishing speed along the alliance's communication channels. The merchant's name would be effectively blacklisted across the entire network. In the coffee houses of London, the fondacos of Venice, and the caravanserais of Aleppo, the word would spread: he is not to be trusted. This was a death sentence for a trading career. No new credit would be extended, no new partnerships formed, no agents would accept his bills of exchange. He became a financial ghost, cut off from the very bloodstream of global commerce. But the sanctions often extended beyond the individual. In close-knit diasporas, the shame and penalty could fall upon the defaulter's entire family, tarnishing their reputation for generations. A son might find his marriage prospects ruined, his own business ventures shunned before they began because of his father's broken promise. This collective accountability turned family honor into a powerful enforcer of contracts. In extreme cases, the network could mobilize for collective retaliation. If a merchant in one city wronged a partner from another, the entire community of the wronged merchant might boycott all trade with that city or with the defaulter's ethnic or religious group, applying crushing economic pressure to force a settlement. This was a form of peer-to-peer justice that made the cost of betrayal unbearably high, not just for the culprit but for his entire community. The credibility of this threat is what made the system work. When a Venetian investor handed a chest of gold florins to a ship captain, he did so not because the law perfectly protected him, but because he knew the captain's future, his family's standing, and his access to the entire mercantile world depended on his honesty. The trust was real, but it was trust backed by the formidable, silent police force of collective reputation. This elegant, brutal system of enforcement reveals the core paradox. The global economy was built on personal honor, precisely because there was no other power strong enough to guarantee it. The silent power of these networks could not remain hidden forever. Their very success created a magnetic pull, drawing the attention of the one force they had long navigated around, the state. The relationship that followed was a dance of mutual dependence and deep suspicion, a symbiosis forever on the verge of turning parasitic. For every king or sultan, the merchant alliances represented a tantalizing paradox. They controlled the very lifeblood of wealth, yet they operated just beyond the full grasp of royal authority. The most logical response was to try and harness this power to make the private network an arm of the crown. The Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, perfected this model. It was not a spontaneous merchant alliance, but a deliberate, state-chartered corporation designed to absorb and weaponize existing private networks. The Dutch state granted it an unprecedented monopoly over all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. In return, it offered shares to the public, pooling capital from thousands of citizens, from wealthy burghers to shopkeepers and servants. This was the ultimate financial innovation. It turned the entire Dutch Republic into a sleeping partner in a global venture. But the VOC's true genius was in its ruthless co-option of the alliance system. It did not build its Asian intelligence web from scratch. It infiltrated and commandeered the existing networks of Gujarati, Chinese, and Malay merchants. It used their knowledge of local markets, their relationships with producers, and their distribution channels, often forcing them into exclusive contracts. The company provided military protection and access to European markets. The local networks provided the goods and the on-the-ground expertise. It was a forced marriage, a state capitalist entity grafting itself onto the organic roots of Asian commerce, leveraging private trust for imperial profit. The tension was inherent from the start. Across the Indian Ocean, the mighty Mughal Empire embodied a different kind of relationship. The Mughal court in Delhi was staggeringly wealthy from land revenue, but its engagement with ocean trade was ambivalent. It relied heavily on the financial and logistical services of merchant networks, both local and foreign. Armenian financiers, with their impeccable credit and far-flung connections, became crucial bankers and mint masters for the empire. European companies, desperate for trading rights, lavished gifts and provided valuable intelligence. The Mughals welcomed this, allowing the alliances to operate within their ports, collecting customs duties and benefiting from the flow of luxury goods. Yet there was always a profound suspicion. To the imperial mind, merchants were useful but socially inferior. Their wealth was fluid and unpredictable, unlike the solid, rooted wealth of land. The state's primary interest was stability and revenue, not the expansion of trade for its own sake. This could lead to sudden, arbitrary interventions, a spike in customs duties, the confiscation of a merchant's assets on a pretext, or the capricious favor of one trading group over another. The alliances, in turn, developed strategies to navigate this tension. They maintained a low profile, avoided flaunting wealth, and cultivated powerful patrons at court through strategic loans and gifts. They kept their core operations and capital movements as opaque as possible, using their private hundies and family ledgers to create a layer of financial secrecy between their true wealth and the tax collector's ledger. This dance was delicate, a constant calculation of how much to offer the state to ensure protection, without ever revealing enough to become a target. The fundamental conflict was one of vision. The merchant alliance thought in terms of networks, profit margins, and long-term credit cycles. The state thought in terms of territory, sovereignty, and immediate revenue. One was fluid and borderless, the other was rigid and defined by maps. When their interests aligned, as with the VOC or the Portuguese crown's use of Genos capital, the results could reshape the world. But when the state saw the alliance not as a partner, but as a rival source of power, the relationship turned predatory. This eternal push and pull between the invisible hand of commerce and the visible fist of empire would define the next great transformation, forcing the alliances to evolve once more or be dissolved entirely. The fluid dance between networks and states could only last so long. A tipping point arrived when the logic of the alliance was captured, scaled up, and hardened into a new kind of entity, one that bore the authority of a state but operated with the singular focus of a merchant. The loose, trust-based webs that had financed the world's connections began to be replaced by something more formidable, the chartered joint stock company. This was not an evolution of the old model, but a corporate transformation that would eventually eclipse it. The English and later the British East India Company, alongside its fierce rival the Dutch East India Company, became the ultimate expression of this shift. They took the core principles of the merchant alliance, pooling capital from many investors and sharing risk across voyages, and institutionalized them with terrifying efficiency. Anyone could now buy a share, from a wealthy London merchant to a modest shopkeeper, turning the entire investing public into sleeping partners on a national project. This created a reservoir of capital so deep it was almost bottomless, funding not just ships but armies, fortresses, and diplomatic missions. The company was granted a royal charter, a piece of parchment that gave it something the old networks never formally possessed: sovereign power. It could mint coins, administer justice, wage war, and claim territory, all in the name of trade. What began as a commercial venture gradually became a hybrid state, a corporate empire that answered to shareholders in London or Amsterdam more directly than to any local population it governed. This scale and power came at a cost, primarily to the older, more organic systems it encountered. The flexible, private networks that had moved spices and silks for centuries found themselves facing not a rival merchant, but a sovereign competitor. The company's monopoly charter meant it could legally forbid independent English or Dutch traders from operating in its zone, cutting off a vital source of capital and competition. More devastatingly, it used its military and diplomatic weight to pressure, co-opt, or outright dismantle local trading alliances. A Gujarati merchant family that had negotiated as equals with Portuguese factors might find itself presented with a stark choice by the East India Company: accept a dictated low price for their goods, or have their ships barred from key ports and their supply chains disrupted by company naval patrols. The company did not need to build trust over generations. It could enforce compliance with the threat of a cannon broadside. The older networks, built on kinship, reciprocity, and nuanced cultural understanding, were ill-equipped to compete with an entity that viewed commerce as a form of conquest backed by actuarial tables and quarterly dividends. The corporate model was brilliantly efficient at extracting wealth and concentrating power, but it sacrificed the resilience and adaptability of the decentralized network. A bad decision by a company director in London could lead to famine in Bengal because the system was now centralized and rigid. The private alliance, when faced with a local crisis, could shift routes, change partners, or absorb losses within its close-knit circle. The corporation, accountable to distant shareholders demanding steady profit, often doubled down on control, leading to catastrophic failures of local understanding. This transformation marked a fundamental change in who shaped the global economy. The quiet, collaborative architect was being replaced by the loud, institutional engineer. The world of trade was moving from a bazaar of countless interconnected deals to a boardroom of consolidated power. Yet, even in the shadow of these corporate giants, the old ways never fully died. They simply learned to survive in the cracks, waiting for the next turn of the wheel. But even the most resilient network cannot outrun time. The very forces that these merchant alliances helped unleash would, in the end, render their unique genius obsolete. Their quiet decline was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual fading as the world they had pioneered became too formal, too fast, and too large for their intimate methods. The 18th and 19th centuries brought a suite of innovations that systematically replaced the need for personal trust with institutional certainty. The first and most direct challenge came from the formalization of finance. For centuries, a bill of exchange was only as good as the reputation of the family that issued it. Now, powerful central banks like the Bank of England or the Banque de France began to issue standardized national currencies and act as lenders of last resort. A pound sterling note was guaranteed by the full faith of the British state, a guarantee far more universal and impersonal than the word of even the most honorable Armenian merchant in New Jolfa. Similarly, the ad hoc coffee house subscriptions for insuring ships evolved into massive, dedicated insurance corporations. Lloyd's of London transformed from a gathering place into a formalized market. You no longer needed to know a captain personally to insure his voyage. You could simply purchase a policy from a company that used actuarial tables to calculate risk based on statistics, not relationships. This was trust quantified and sold as a product. The second great shift was in the realm of law. The merchant alliances had thrived in the gray areas between empires, governed by their own private codes and pea-powder courts. The 19th century saw a relentless push to codify and standardize international commercial law. Treaties established clear rules for maritime commerce, liability, and contract enforcement that were recognized across borders. A dispute between a British importer and a French exporter could now be settled in a consular court applying predictable statutes, rather than relying on the judgment of a merchant council. This legal scaffolding provided a one-size-fits-all security that was available to everyone, diminishing the competitive advantage of being inside a closed, trusted circle. The most profound change, however, was the annihilation of time and distance. For a millennium, the entire architecture of these alliances was built on the slow rhythm of sailing ships and couriers on horseback. The arrival of the electric telegraph in the mid-19th century shattered that rhythm forever. Suddenly, a price change in London could be known in Calcutta within hours, not months. This destroyed the informational edge that was the lifeblood of the old networks. The merchant in Amsterdam no longer held a decisive advantage because he received news from his cousin in Batavia 6 weeks before the general market. Now everyone knew at once. The telegraph, followed by the transoceanic cable, created a single, nearly instantaneous global marketplace. In this new world, speed was dictated by technology, not by the quality of your courier network. Capital could be moved with a click of a telegraph key, making the physical bill of exchange seem archaic. The need for a trusted agent to make decisions on your behalf halfway across the world diminished when you could instruct him directly within a day. This convergence of forces, formal banks, standardized law, and instant communication, empowered the final actors that would dominate the new age, the nation-state and the industrial corporation. These entities operated on a scale of capital and coercion that no private alliance could match. Colonial empires now directly controlled the sources of raw materials and the markets for finished goods, imposing tariffs and trade policies that redirected commerce into official channels. Large industrial firms, with their own vertically integrated operations, from raw material extraction to global distribution, had less need for the intermediary services of flexible merchant networks. The old alliances did not vanish overnight. They retreated into the niches where their personal touch still held value, in high-end luxury trades, in regions where formal institutions were weak, or within specific diaspora communities preserving traditional commerce. But their era as the primary architects of global connection was over. They had built the bridge between a fragmented world and an integrated one, and in doing so, they built the very system that would eventually walk across that bridge and leave them behind. This raises a final, haunting reflection. In our own digital age, where trust is often mediated by algorithms and star ratings, have we lost something essential that those merchants, writing their names on a parchment in a dusty port, understood in their bones? Their world was built on discretion, which makes our ability to see it at all a kind of historical miracle. The merchant alliances left behind no grand monuments declaring their power, no official chronicles commissioned by kings. Instead, the evidence of their quiet empire survives in the mundane paperwork of commerce, scattered across continents and written in dozens of languages. To reconstruct their story, historians must become detectives, piecing together a global puzzle from fragments that were never meant for public view. The trail begins in dusty archives, in the bound leather volumes of private account books. These are the internal ledgers of a family firm, often written in a cryptic mix of languages and personal shorthand. A single page might record a loan to a ship's captain in Genoa, a payment received from a factor in Aleppo, and the settling of a debt with a silk supplier in Persia, all connected by the elegant logic of double-entry bookkeeping. These books are treasure maps of trust, showing capital flowing along the invisible lines of kinship and partnership, but they are also deliberately opaque, designed to be fully understood only by the merchant who kept them, protecting the network's secrets even on paper. More revealing are the records of the notaries. In port cities from Barcelona to Alexandria, these legal scribes recorded the birth of every partnership. Their massive registers contain thousands of Commenda contracts, powers of attorney, and bills of lading, each one a snapshot of a specific deal. Here we find the raw data of the alliance, the names of the silent investor and the traveling agent, the exact split of profits, the description of the cargo, and the ship's intended destination. A single notarial archive can reveal the geographic reach of a merchant's network, the names of his repeated partners, and the evolution of standard contract terms over decades. It is in these dry, formulaic documents that we see the system's engine turning, transaction by transaction. When those transactions went wrong, they produced another vital source: court records. Lawsuits over unpaid bills, disputes about spoiled cargo, or accusations of fraud forced these private arrangements into the public light of a courtroom. The testimony recorded in these cases is a gold mine. It gives us the voices of the merchants themselves, their arguments, their excuses, and their detailed descriptions of standard business practice. A lawsuit between a Venetian investor and a ship's captain might reveal the going interest rate for a Bottomry loan, or describe the exact moment a cargo was considered lost at sea. These conflicts expose the points of friction in the system, showing us where the elegant theory of trust met the messy reality of human error and temptation. Perhaps the most intimate windows are the personal letters that somehow survived centuries of movement. These were the lifeblood of the network, carried by trusted couriers across oceans. A merchant writing to his brother stationed in a distant port would mix family news with urgent business, instructing him on which local official to bribe, which competitor to undercut, and which rumor of war to believe. The letters are filled with anxiety and hope, revealing the emotional weight of managing such vast, unseen operations. They show that behind every dry entry in a ledger was a person, straining to hear news over an impossible distance, gambling a fortune on the integrity of a cousin they might not see for 10 years. Finally, there are the merchant manuals, practical guides written by experienced traders for their sons or apprentices. These manuals did not explain high finance, they dealt with the gritty details: how to judge the quality of pepper by its smell, how to calculate customs duties in a foreign port, how to detect a forged bill of exchange, and which trading communities in a given city could be trusted. They codified the hard-won, tacit knowledge of the trade, passing the network's operational wisdom down to the next generation. The challenge for historians is that all these sources are fragmentary and scattered. A family's archive might survive in Venice, while the records of their partners in Cairo have been lost to fire or decay. A court case in London might mention an Armenian intermediary whose own papers are in an archive in Armenia. Piecing together a single network's full scope requires linguistic skill, patience, and a lot of luck. This is why the full story of these alliances remains partially hidden. a silhouette we see only when the light from these disparate archives briefly overlaps. They designed their world to be quiet, and for the most part, history has obliged them. Yet, from these silent fragments, an astonishing picture still emerges, not of a few lone adventurers, but of a vast, collaborative machine that quietly wired the world together long before the word globalization was ever spoken. The principles that financed a spice ship are the same ones that fund a tech startup today. The merchant alliances did not just move goods, they built the very conceptual architecture of modern finance, an architecture we still inhabit. Their innovations were not replaced, they were simply scaled up, digitized, and given new names. The quiet contracts of the past are the invisible frameworks of our global economy. Take the Commenda, that temporary partnership between a sedentary investor and a traveling merchant. Its DNA is unmistakable in modern venture capital. A venture capitalist today is the sedentary investor pooling money from limited partners, people like pension funds or wealthy individuals. The tech entrepreneur is the traveling merchant, venturing into the uncharted territory of a new market, providing the sweat and expertise. The structure is a direct descendant. The investors provide the capital and take on the financial risk of total loss, while the entrepreneur stakes their time and reputation for a share of the future profits. This is not a vague similarity. It is a direct lineage of risk-sharing logic, perfected centuries ago on the docks of Genoa and Venice to fund journeys into the unknown. That logic extends further into the limited liability partnership, the bedrock of so much modern investment. The sleeping partners of old, the nobles and bishops who funded voyages, are today's limited partners in a private equity fund. Their risk is capped at their investment, just as it was in a Commenda, and they have no role in day-to-day management. The entire structure of separating capital from labor, of allowing passive wealth to fuel high-risk innovation, was a merchant alliance invention. Now follow the journey of the bill of exchange, that piece of parchment that moved value across continents. It never went away, it evolved. In today's global trade, its direct heir is the letter of credit issued by a bank. When an electronics manufacturer in Seoul needs to assure a supplier in Malaysia of payment, they do not send a chest of cash. Their bank issues a letter of credit, a guaranteed promise to pay upon proof of shipment. This is the bill of exchange with a digital signature and a bank's backing instead of a single merchant's reputation. The entire foreign exchange market, where trillions move daily between currencies, is the monumental, electronic offspring of the need those merchants had to settle accounts between Lisbon and Amsterdam. They created the first functional system of international credit and exchange rates because they had to, and we have been refining their system ever since. Even the most dramatic moments of risk were systematized into permanence. The ad hoc subscriptions in Edward Lloyd's coffee house, where merchants would sign their names to share the risk of a voyage, did not remain a casual practice. They institutionalized into Lloyd's of London, the world's premier insurance market. The core principle remains identical, spreading catastrophic risk across a wide pool of capital so no single loss is devastating. Modern insurance, from your car policy to corporate catastrophe bonds, operates on this exact merchant alliance logic. They taught the world that risk could be measured, priced, and traded, transforming uncertainty from a paralyzing fear into a manageable business expense. The most profound legacy, however, is conceptual. These alliances forged the fundamental frameworks we use to think about finance itself. The idea of a corporation as a legal entity separate from its owners, capable of raising capital from the public, finds its roots in the chartered trading companies like the East India Company, which were themselves supersized versions of the partnership model. The very notion of credit, of trusting in a future promise of payment across a distance, was normalized and operationalized by their networks. They developed the tools for transparency and accountability, like double-entry bookkeeping, which remains the global standard for corporate accounting. In essence, they built the grammar of capitalism. Every time a startup secures funding, a container ship sails under a letter of credit, or a financial analyst models risk, they are speaking a language first written by those quiet financiers in port cities centuries ago. Their world was one of sailing ships and handwritten ledgers, but the financial architecture they designed was so robust, so logically sound, that it could scale to a digital, instantaneous global system. We have not left their world behind. We are living inside the monumental cathedral they designed, often without realizing who the architects were. The political maps of the 16th century show empires expanding in bold colors, but the real lines of connection were drawn in subtler ink. This evidence forces a fundamental reassessment of how our world became linked. The traditional narrative of early globalization is a top-down story, one of kings dispatching fleets, planting flags, and imposing monopolies. But the deeper history reveals a far more intricate and human process. Long before empires consolidated their claims, the world was being woven together from the bottom up, stitch by careful stitch, by the very alliances we have traced. These merchant networks were the true pioneers of globalization, not as conquerors but as connectors. Their story suggests that sustained, large-scale intercontinental trade was not the prize seized by empires, but the prerequisite that made their ambitions feasible in the first place. Think of it this way: an empire could charter a fleet, but it could not create a market. It could claim a coastline, but it could not fabricate the trust needed to move a fortune across it. The merchant alliances provided the operating system, the essential software of trust, credit, and information upon which the hardware of empires eventually ran. The Portuguese carracks sailed on Genoa's capital. The Spanish silver from Potosi reached China through the ledgers of Armenian intermediaries in Manila. The spices that filled European warehouses were sourced through Gujarati and Tamil webs that predated European arrival by centuries. In each case, imperial power plugged into a pre-existing, functioning circuit of commerce. This bottom-up process was inherently networked. There was no central command, no grand design from a single capital. Instead, globalization emerged from a million individual decisions, a fractal pattern of partnerships repeating from port to port. A deal in Malacca influenced a price in Venice, which triggered an investment in Lisbon, which funded a voyage to Goa. It was a distributed, resilient system. When one node was disrupted by war or disaster, the network simply rerouted, finding a new path through a cousin in another city or a different alliance altogether. This incremental, organic growth is why the system proved so durable. It was not imposed, it was cultivated through mutual benefit and tested by relentless risk. The most profound contribution of these networks was the creation of connective tissue, the financial and social infrastructure that made long-distance exchange not just possible but routine. They built the pipes through which global wealth could flow. The bill of exchange was a pipe for moving value. The Commenda partnership was a pipe for moving capital into high-risk ventures. The diaspora community was a pipe for moving trust and information. Without these innovations, intercontinental trade would have remained a series of isolated, heroic expeditions, not a continuous, humming system. Empires provided the political shell, often the coercive force, but the merchant alliances provided the circulatory system within it. They solved the practical, gritty problems of how to pay, how to insure, how to communicate, and how to trust across vast divides. This revised understanding shifts our perspective on power itself. It suggests that in the early modern world, significant power was diffuse, held in the collective reputation of a trading family, in the binding force of a handwritten contract, and in the swift currents of information flowing along private channels. A king could command an army, but he could not easily command the price of pepper in Antwerp, which was set by a hidden calculus of monsoons, caravans, and the collective confidence of merchants from a dozen cultures. Recognizing this bottom-up origin does not diminish the later impact of empires or corporations, but it reframes them. It shows that the first global economy was a collaborative, if often unequal, construction. It was built in the multilingual bustle of port cities, in the back rooms of counting houses, and in the personal letters between partners who bridged worlds. The empires that followed often standardized, monopolized, and militarized these connections, but they rarely invented them. The quiet architects had already drawn the blueprint, proving that the world could be connected through agreement long before it was fully conquered by decree. The archives offer us ledgers and letters, but the true volume of their world remains a haunting echo. We can count the surviving contracts, tally the ships listed in port records, but the sheer scale of capital they moved is ultimately unknowable. For every documented voyage financed by a Commenda, how many more were arranged with a simple handshake and a shared glass of wine, leaving no trace for historians to find? The formal contracts we study in notarial registers were likely just the tip of an iceberg, with a vast substructure of informal, oral agreements holding everything together. These were deals sealed on trust alone, between partners who knew their word was their bond, because their entire commercial future depended on it. How many fortunes were built and lost on promises that never touched parchment? This informal layer is the silent majority of their history, forever erased. Consider the countless ventures that ended not with profit but with silence. A ship disappears in a storm, its loss noted in a margin. A trading post is overrun in a local conflict we have no record of. A merchant goes bankrupt, his papers burned or sold for scrap. These failures are the missing data points, the negative space that would complete the picture. If we only study the successes, the ledgers that survived because the business thrived for generations, we get a distorted view. We see a world of astonishing efficiency and low risk, but the reality must have been far messier, filled with quiet tragedies and bankruptcies that dissolved networks overnight. What was the true failure rate? How much capital simply vanished into the ocean or was swallowed by a distant war? We will likely never know, and that unknown shadow makes their achievements all the more remarkable. They built a global system not in spite of constant loss, but by learning to move forward despite it. Even within the alliances that succeeded, the mechanics of governance are often opaque to us. When a dispute arose between a Gujarati Bania in Aden and his partner in Diu, with no central court or written contract to appeal to, how was justice served? The threat of ostracism was powerful, but the process of arbitration remains hidden. Did elders from both families exchange letters? Did they meet at a neutral port during the trading season? The resolutions were probably as varied and nuanced as the conflicts themselves, relying on a deep cultural understanding of honor and compromise that official documents rarely capture. This was a system of law that lived in the air, in the conversations on crowded wharves, and in the quiet counsel of respected community leaders. Its rules were unwritten, but they were understood by everyone in the network, which is why they worked. The silence in the historical record on these daily adjudications is not an absence of order, but proof of a different kind of order, one that was organic, flexible, and ultimately invisible to outsiders. This enduring mystery is the final, fitting testament to their quiet power. They shaped the world not by announcing their presence, but by operating in the spaces between official histories. Their greatest legacy is the connected globe we inhabit, a system they built one trusted agreement at a time. Yet the very intimacy of their method, the reliance on personal bonds and spoken words, ensures that much of their story will stay forever in the shadows. We are left with the outlines, the magnificent silhouette of their achievement, while the human whispers that filled it have drifted away on the same winds that carried their ships. And so we are left to wonder, listening to the rustle of old parchment, for the echoes of a world built on trust. The same ledgers that tracked pepper and silk also held entries for a far more tragic cargo. To tell the full story of these networks is to acknowledge a profound and painful duality. While they were engines of connection, they were also, at times, instruments of profound suffering, their brilliant systems adapted to serve the darkest corners of human commerce. The very mechanisms that moved spices and silver with such efficiency were tragically repurposed to facilitate one of history's greatest injustices, the transatlantic slave trade. The financial architecture was eerily similar. The voyage of a slave ship was a high-risk maritime venture requiring substantial upfront capital. Merchant alliances in ports like Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, and Lisbon provided that capital using familiar instruments. Investors would buy shares in a slaving voyage, spreading the financial risk just as they did for a spice run. Bills of exchange were used to pay for captives on the African coast, and insurance policies, negotiated in the same coffee houses, were written to cover the loss of human life at sea as if it were spoiled cargo. The cold, calculating logic of the Commenda partnership was applied to a traffic in people, turning human beings into entries on a balance sheet, their value measured solely in profit and loss. This was the ultimate corruption of the merchants' trust network. Its innovative tools harnessed not to bridge cultures, but to enable a system of brutal extraction. Furthermore, these alliances were often the silent partners in colonial extraction. A European trading company, armed with its state charter, would arrive in Asia or the Americas. But to actually extract wealth, it needed on-the-ground intelligence, local supply chains, and distribution networks. It frequently turned to existing indigenous merchant groups, forcing them into exclusive, unequal partnerships. A local trading alliance might be coerced into selling its goods only to the company at fixed, low prices, while being compelled to buy the company's imports at a high markup. The trust that bound the internal network was used to enforce a monopoly against the wider community, diverting local wealth into colonial channels. The system's greatest strength, its exclusive trust, was also its inherent limitation. The profound solidarity within a Gujarati Bania family or an Armenian diaspora created a safe, efficient zone for its members, but that zone had walls. Those outside the network without the right name, faith, or family connections were often excluded from its benefits and protections. They could be relegated to the most dangerous, least profitable roles or exploited as cheap labor. The network's internal ethics of honesty and reciprocity did not necessarily extend beyond its own boundary, creating a world of insiders and outsiders. This duality does not erase their ingenuity, but it complicates their legacy. They were architects of connection in a world that was also being built on conquest and coercion. Their story is a reminder that systems are tools, and the same financial ingenuity that can weave a world together can also be used to bind it in chains. The ledgers, in the end, hold both the record of human collaboration and the accounting of its deepest failures, written in the same meticulous hand. Their legacy is written in the invisible architecture of our daily world. The merchant alliances were the indispensable, quiet financiers who made the first age of globalization possible. They tamed the terrifying risks of oceanic trade not with cannons, but with contracts, not with conquest, but with calculated cooperation. Their innovations in partnership, credit, insurance, and information management wove a web of economic interdependence across cultures and continents long before political maps acknowledged the connection. They proved that trust could be engineered, that capital could be fluid, and that a handshake between strangers from different worlds could be the strongest bond of all. We live in the world they built, a world connected by the financial grammar they invented. Every time we see a global supply chain move, a startup receive venture funding, or a currency exchange happen seamlessly, we are witnessing the evolved echo of their quiet revolution. Their story is more than a footnote in economic history. It is a profound testament to human ingenuity in the face of immense uncertainty. It shows us that our interconnected world began not with a single empire's decree, but with 1,000,000 private agreements, a slow, stubborn stitching together of the globe by people who chose to build bridges of mutual interest. So the next time you consider the vast, complex systems that shape our modern life, pause and ask yourself, what other quiet architectures of cooperation are operating just beneath the surface of history? What unseen networks of trust are quietly shaping our future right now? The past is filled with such hidden blueprints waiting to be discovered. If you found this exploration of the silent forces that connected our world compelling, please engage with the channel. There are countless more stories of hidden history waiting to be told.